What a weekend this has been. Peter Maravellis here. We have reached the final session of our program. I see so many of you who have really stuck through with us. It's very heartening to see. We've had such a great time. It is hard to see this end. Really, thank you. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of City Lights booksellers and publishers, the City Lights Foundation, and our partners at PM Press, I'd like to welcome you to session 8, the final session of Dangerous Visions and New Worlds. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral grounds of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples, also known as the San Francisco Bay Area. We take a moment to acknowledge their stewardship of the land, past, present, and future. This final session of the day is titled False Dawns and Wandergrounds, Dystopia Then and Now. It will feature Nick Mamatas as moderator. He's going to be joined by Matt Bell, Cory Doctorow, Vandana Singh, and VanderMeer. A few words about our participants. Nick Mamatas is a horror, science fiction, and fantasy author and editor for Haikasoro's line of translated Japanese science fiction novels for Viz Media. His fiction has been nominated for numerous awards. He is the author of 6 novels, including The Last Weekend, Love is the Law, amongst others. His latest collection is Necronomicon from Innsmouth Free Press. His novels have been translated into numerous languages. Joining him will be Matt Bell. Matt Bell is the author of numerous novels, his most notable being Appleseed, a New York Times notable book. His craft novel, Refused to be Done, A Guide to Writing, is due shortly from Soho Press. We're going to be featuring him for that in our event series, so please do check that out on the City Lights calendar. He's also the author of numerous other novels, including Scrapper, In the House, Upon the Dirt, Upon the Lake, and the Woods. Really one of my favorite titles. His writing has appeared in the New York Times, Esquire, Tin House, American Short Fiction, as well as many other outlets. He teaches creative writing at Arizona State University. Also joining us is Cory Doctorow. Cory Doctorow is a blogger, journalist, and award-winning science fiction author who has served as co-editor of the blog Boing Boing. He is a Creative Commons activist and has served as Canadian Regional Director of the Science Fiction and Fantasy Writers of America. In 2007, together with the Austrian art group Monochrome, he initiated the Instant Blitz Copy Fight project. He's received numerous honors for his work, including a Prometheus Award, a Locust Award for Best First Novel, and much, much more. Also joining us is Vandana Singh. Vandana Singh is a science fiction writer, physicist, and professor of physics and environment at Framingham State University in Massachusetts. In 2021, she became the Climate Imagination Fellow at the Center for Science and Imagination at Arizona State, and also serves on the advisory council of METI. Her short fiction has appeared in numerous collections, including Year's Best Science Fiction and Year's Best Fantasy and Horror. Also, Foundation, the International Review of Science Fiction, amongst others. She has 2 collections of short stories, and most recent of which, Ambiguity Machines and Other Stories, which is a 2018 Philip K. Dick Award finalist. And last but not least, we are delighted to have VanderMeer with us. VanderMeer is a publisher and editor and the second female editor of the horror magazine Weird Tales. She is the founder of Buzz City Press and also the founder of the Silver Web magazine, a periodical devoted to experimental and avant-garde fantasy literature. She has received numerous honors for her work. Her work as fiction editor for Weird Tales won a Hugo Award. She has edited with her husband, Jeff VanderMeer, much influential and award-winning anthologies such as New Weird, The Weird, and The Big Book of Science Fiction. So wow, what an all-star cast to end our program. A reminder before we start, we're going to be posting links in the chat function with which you may purchase copies of Dangerous Vision. We still have a few left, so do get them while you can. We're also selling books by today's participants. We'll be posting links for that. So please welcome now Nick Mamatas to moderate our final session.
Thank you, Peter. So that was really interesting so far. That bio was a little out of date. That was my pre-COVID bio, and that I've not worked for that company for years. I thought other books come out. The books mentioned were largely out of print. And so there's a big division, at least in my life, between pre-COVID and now COVID, which is highly dystopian. So I guess my first question for everybody's, how's your dystopia going? Cory, how's your dystopia?
I'm trying to interface with Zoom's cursed chat. My dystopia has been extraordinarily productive in as much as I cope with anxiety by writing. So I mean, I do spend the majority of my time, and have done for 20 years, in a room on my own, making up imaginary people and trying to entertain myself with them. So in that regard, it wasn't hugely different. But at the same time, the stress and anxiety has been pretty intense, as it, I imagine, has been for everyone else. For me, the thing that I've tried very much to keep alive is the hope that the dystopia is a turning point. That some of the things that were latent contradictions and unsustainable practices would reach a breaking point, and we'd finally do something about them. I think that there are some glimmers of hope like that. For about 20 years, I've campaigned on broadband access, and to great indifference from the political class. And we just saw $65 billion apportioned for municipal broadband in the infrastructure bill. And I think people just reached the point where they were unwilling to use tin cans and string to enter the 21st century, no matter that such a thing was very important to Comcast's shareholders. And somehow we managed to break the political deadlock, which was pretty interesting.
All right. So I've definitely not had that experience of being very productive. Matt, how about you? How's your dystopia going? Matt Bell, who's on the panel.
Did you say Matt, Nick? Yes, sorry. Yes, thank you. Sorry, it's cutting out a little bit for me. Yeah, I mean, probably the same stuff as other people. I was just in Michigan visiting my family there. I live in Phoenix now, and I think the COVID, the year where we couldn't travel at all, or was felt very unsafe to travel, was the first time I think I've ever really not been able to be with my people when I wanted to be, or really not be able to make that decision. And I know that was one of those things that is going to stick with me after this. It was easy to live across the country when I could go home when I wanted to. And that feeling of being separated by circumstance from the people you care about was much more difficult than I sort of imagined. And I think will probably change what my life looks like going forward in many ways.
Okay. And your dystopia?
Well, my house is very clean. It's very clean. But I want to say that when the shutdown first started, I decided to start an online Skype reading session with my grandchildren. I have two grandkids that live in LA and the other one that lives in Amsterdam. So we were dealing with 3 time zones, and they're all boys and different ages. So every single day for almost 2 years, I got onto my computer every afternoon and read stories to them. And because we live so far apart, this was really fantastic because I was able to see them and talk to them every single day. And, of course, there was a lot of complaining and eye rolling, because they're starting to become teenagers and all, but it was really kind of neat to do that. And also to spend time trying to find the right books to read to them, things that they could be excited about. And also things that I enjoyed reading, because one of the things that I did is I did not read ahead. I waited until the day that I was supposed to read the next chapter, and then I would read it. So we were all 5 of us discovering things together. So that was really cool.
Did you read any dystopian fiction to them?
Actually, I did read some because apparently that's very popular. So and the kids seem to like that. I read most of the stuff that I was reading was YA, but I also wanted to read some works in translation. So I read Tove Jansson books to them, which they really enjoyed, and different things like that. And then I also read Alice in Wonderland because one of my grandsons loves Alice in Wonderland. So we read that. And then we also read all of the Miss Peregrine's Peculiar Children books. We read that whole series. So that was quite interesting.
All right. And Vandana, how has your dystopia been?
Oh, well, it's been stressful. And I know that it's been really stressful for young people because I teach undergraduates. And, there seems to be, the epidemic of anxiety seems to have gotten worse. So I haven't had much time to write really, and been spending more time, as part of the research I do as a transdisciplinary scholar of climate change. And if you follow what's happening to people around the world, like I'm having a very comfortable dystopia, compared to what a lot of communities around the world are going through. So I'm always reminded of that.
Excellent. So we were talking before the panel began about dystopian fiction and where it comes from. And of course, we can think of ancient utopias, but dystopias seem to be, at least as far as a literary invention, more recent. Like people often say The Last Man by Mary Shelley is the first dystopian. It probably isn't. There's probably going to be somebody in the chat in 2 seconds here, hopefully at it, to correct me. But in case not, let's start with the assumption that dystopian fictions are relatively recent. Why do we think, we'll start with you, Vandana, we'll just go back and forth, we'll ping pong back and forth, at least as far as according to how it looks on my screen. Unless we just lost you. Oh my God, the dystopia got to her, I think. She's frozen. Matt, so why do you think dystopia is now that we are at least in relatively comfortable terms, or even our dystopias are relatively comfortable? Why is dystopian fiction so popular?
I don't know. Right. I was thinking, I've probably been reading dystopian fiction my whole life in one fashion or another, right? Like it's always been part of that. I remember a novel by H.M. Hoover called This Time of Darkness. It's like a middle grade novel with like an underground city and a surveillance state, and people weren't allowed to learn to read. And I remember loving that book when I was in the 5th grade or something. So I know, something that's always been sort of present. When we were talking about an email, I was trying to think if there's, is the link like the Industrial Revolution? Is it is it a social stratification that makes other lives visible? Is it, being able to sort of see some of that makes it more clear how that could be sort of amplified. But yeah, I think in some ways I can think of it more clearly, like in a personal way, like the way that I might be interested in it. But I'm not sure, except that we're probably always interested in worst case scenarios, right? There is a sort of one way to prepare for worst case scenarios is to imagine them. And it seems like that might be a fairly natural mode of being.
Welcome back, Vandana. So why do you think dystopian fiction, which I would recommend, which I would just say to the chat, is different from outright religious texts? Why do you think it's popular today?
Why do you think it's popular today?
Popular? Yeah.
Yeah.
We're having a panel about it.
Well, I mean, it feels like we're living in the end times, doesn't it? And, when I talk to young people in their late teens and early 20s, they seem to almost like accept that, well, the world's going to hell no matter what. There's almost like a resignation. And in a way, when they engage with dystopias, it seems to confirm this feeling. So it's a sort of feedback loop, which I find disturbing, actually. But I think that so many things are unraveling that it seems quite natural that you want to read something that confirms that impression. And at the same time, we can't afford to give in to that either, even though dystopias are important as warnings. But at the same time, if the context is such that there's nothing else, then we are in trouble.
Cory, you're the resident techno-optimist. Why do you think dystopia is so popular?
Well,
and techno-utopian is so much less popular.
Yeah, I wanna locate our current vogue for dystopia in capitalist realism, and this idea from the dawn of the neoliberal era of Margaret Thatcher that there is no alternative, or as Jameson translated it, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than the end of capitalism. And for those of us who are not well served by the system, or who can see that it has unsustainable flaws, notably climate problems, but also very much of the moment, the rise of nuclear arsenals. If you really believe there is no alternative, then that is a very dystopian future to contemplate, because it's one in which we seem to be going on rails towards a catastrophe. I like to think of the capitalist realist kind of motif as being trapped on a bus, barreling towards a cliff edge. And the driver has insisted that it would just be irresponsible to turn the wheel because we could just have faith that the bus will figure out how to fly before we reach the edge of the cliff. And whenever you talk about turning the wheel, they say, but think about what would happen if the bus rolled. Someone might break their leg. And you say, but what if the bus goes off the cliff? We'll all die. And they say, well, eventually we'll figure out how to make the bus fly. We haven't run out of roads so far. Why would we run out of road just because we reach the edge of the cliff? And I think that when we contemplate technology and its potential benefits and its manifest harms, that the idea that we could repurpose technology to serve us is not hard to imagine kind of in the abstract, right? As I wrote in Locus last month that since the Luddites, right, we've had a critique of technology that focused not on what the machine did, but who it does it for and who it does it to, and reimagining those social relations. But in the frame of capitalist realism, in the frame of there is no alternative, although we can imagine turning the wheel, although we could imagine an internet that wasn't 5 giant websites filled with screenshots of text from the other 4, we are incapable of imagining the path that we would get to by it. I see someone in the chat mentions KSR. I think the thing that was very remarkable about the Ministry for the Future is that unlike all of his other books, which elided the transition from danger to salvation, right? They were all post-salvation or pre-salvation novels. None of them actually took you through the revolution. And the thing that's remarkable about his book is that it lays out a somewhat plausible, modulo all the cryptocurrency nonsense, path through a crisis, which is, I think, a really interesting thing. And to the point of not wanting to turn the wheel lest you break someone's leg, his transition involves spectacular acts of terrorist violence that murder innocents in their thousands. And for all that his book visits every point of view of every character who is everywhere that matters in the transition, we never touch the minds of the terrorists nor their victims. And I think that Stan didn't want to think about someone breaking their leg after you seize the wheel, for good reason. He's a gentle fellow and doesn't want to think that there is a transition that will involve a lot of innocent bloodshed, and yet he seemed to imply it. And so I find that endlessly fascinating. I think maybe the most interesting thing to happen in science fiction in the last year was Stan's decision not to show you the terrorists or their victims.
All right, that's Kim Stanley Robinson, by the way, since you said KSR and Stan. So if you're looking it up, Kim Stanley Robinson. And why are dystopias popular, dystopian fiction popular?
I've been thinking about this a lot because we do seem to be drawn to it. I don't think it's just a fad that has happened recently. I think that it's something that we've always been drawn to, not just as creators, but also as consumers. And I was thinking about when we first had the shutdown almost 2 years ago, I don't know why, but everyone started to watch Contagion. That movie was available free and everyone was watching it. And after we watched it, I looked at my husband, I said, I can't believe we watched that movie. We're in the middle of a pandemic. Why are we watching this movie? But we were drawn to that. And then of course, last week, we started watching The Hot Zone. So what's wrong with us? I don't know. But I was thinking about why we gravitate towards that type of fiction. And I almost feel like as humans, we have this innate desire to fix things and make them better. So that when we take a look at dystopian movies, books, stories, we're looking for the way in those dystopias that we can make a change, even if it's just a little area here or a little part there. But I feel like it's kind of a way for us to deal with the craziness of what's going on in our life. So here I am watching all these stupid pandemic movies. Why would I do that? And trying not to stress out about it. But you know, in almost every single one of those movies, there's a result at the end, everyone's saved, blah, blah, blah. You know, sure, some people died, but not the main guy, right? And that doesn't always happen in dystopian books, I know, but I do think that even when we know that things are going to end badly, we're still, the entire time that we're reading, we're still hopeful that somehow it's going to change by just our sheer willpower or something. So I'm wondering if it's kind of a way for us to feel like we're more in control, in a sense, for things that we really don't have any control over. So maybe that's what the thing is. And of course, with YA fiction, with teenagers, you're also dealing with this high level of drama and angst. So of course, dystopian fiction is the type of thing that they would be drawn to because they like all that kind of stuff. It gives them that heightened sense of drama and conflict. So of course, it's going to be that. And I think that in some sense, when we get older, we don't truly 100% outgrow that need for there to be some kind of drama in our life. And I think we would rather have our drama play out in our fiction than living through it, which is what we're doing right now.
And sometimes we don't have the choice. I'll give it a quick example from my own tiny career. A couple of years ago, right before the plague, I was asked to write a short story about the future of cities, or an anthology about the future of cities. And then of course the plague hit, and I heard nothing about this project for some time. And then the editor got back to me saying, Nick, are you writing about the future of cities? And I said, I wasn't, of course. But I said, of course I am. I'm working on this story very, diligently. And he said, can it be terrible? Because all the stories we're getting are terrible. It's not going to be about the future of cities anymore. It's going to be called Out of the Ruins, because everybody handed in a crap sack dystopian future. And so I wrote a utopia, actually. That is like a terrible utopia. And that's one thing that's very interesting to me, is that in dystopian fiction, there's often a utopia. Part of why I'm on this panel is because in this book that you should all buy from City Lights, Dangerous Visions and New Worlds, I wrote about R.A. Lafferty. And he is most famous for the novel Past Master, where Thomas More is brought to this future utopia where nobody wants to live there. And they all want to live in the dystopia next door. And that's the sort of a secret of the novel, is why would they want to live in the dystopia? But it turns out that some people want to live in dystopias. Of course, there are people who are actively making our world a dystopia. But then there's just things like reading books from the 70s about dystopias, like, people are mentioning Brunner, like The Sheep Look Up and things like that. If you look at these novels now, I would think, it's not so bad. I got worse outside. So even our vision of what is a dystopia and what is a utopia, because often utopias have a dystopic strand in them, so they're intertwined between utopia and dystopia. And I'm wondering if dystopia emerged from utopia because we have this idea of a vision, a heavenly vision on Earth, but then we need to have that kind of warning too. And so that brings my next question to, what dystopias have you read recently, and the chat can answer this too, that you wouldn't mind living in? And we'll start with you, Anne, and we'll go back.
Oh gosh.
Pick your favorite utopia. If you had to live in a dystopia, which one would it be?
Oh, I really don't know if I can answer that question, because I don't know if I would want to.
You already live in Florida, so you're halfway
I want
there.
to live in Moomin Land. That's where I want to live. I want to live in Moomin Land.
Cory, pick a dystopia.
Yeah, I'm actually just looking up the URL for it here. Ian MacDonald, I think it was his second novel out on Blue Six. Maybe it was his debut. It's an absolutely stunning kind of Huxley pastiche with bits of Gibson, and it's sort of Terry Gilliam's Brazil, and also David Byrne makes an appearance. There's religions based on, like, syncretic faiths based on football matches. And everybody is watched over by tiny sock puppet robots that work for the vast AI that structures society. And it's written in beautiful kind of lyric poetry. And I wrote the introduction for the reissue some years ago. And I would happily live in Out on Blue Six. It would be, if nothing else, a much more interesting and lively dystopia than the one that I live in here.
Matt, favorite dystopia? Where are you going to live in dystopia?
Where am I going to live in dystopia?
Yeah, what dystopia?
I was thinking about Jonathan Letham's The Arrest that just came out this last year or two, and especially in the first half of it has this like society's collapse, but the little bubble society you're in is like post-police, kind of agrarian, people are taking care of each other. Even the people who are the criminals of the world are still sort of like just put a place where they can't hurt anybody, and we kind of take care of them. And it's this very gentle sort of dystopia for a while, until of course the dystopia next door starts bumping into it. But I think there's a lulling of sort of peace in that one, where it's like this society collapsed in the best possible way for these people, at least.
Vandana, do you have a dystopia you'd prefer to live in? Not referring to your real life, but you had to pick a dystopia. Which dystopia might it be?
Do I absolutely have to be living in a dystopia? Well, I have the luxury of choice, but I suppose, one of the things that speaks to me a lot in fiction is landscape. And while you guys were talking, I was thinking about Nnedi Okorafor's Who Fears Death, because she makes the landscape come alive in such an incredible way. So I think I would find that interesting. Even though I wouldn't choose to live in a dystopia.
And let's see, here's someone mentions Walden 2 as a dystopia, even though it's intended to be a utopia. And that is actually an interesting thing that happens, because one person's utopia is another person's dystopia, and vice versa. I read a story in the magazine of fantasy and science fiction a couple of years ago by Harry Turtledove. I forget the name of the story. But that's not the important part of this story, which is that the story was about California being taken over by the communists. And the communists were running everything. And this poor guy in his fruit stand, he put up an anti-communist sign, so he was thrown away. He was removed from his fruit stand and forced to work in a warehouse. And he brings in a dolly, and he says, you can't use a dolly because you're being punished, because this is communism. And even though it was terrible communism, he'd go home to his wife, who worked from home, who was a homemaker, and she'd have a brandy waiting for him. And they talk about the troubles of communism. And what they weren't worried about was, now that you lost your job at the fruit stand, how are you going to pay for their mortgage, because it was communism? And there's no question about their massive debts because it was communism, or how they're going to afford surgery and healthcare because it was communism. So even though it was obvious dystopian future, and I don't want to live under that kind of Stalinist communism either, I sure would like to have free rent and brandy, government issued brandy. So one of the things that's really interesting is that some people's dystopia feels utopian, and some people's utopia feels very dystopian. When you read a lot of utopias about, say, futuristic non-capitalist economies, they often involve things like a lot of meetings. Or if you're involved in anarchist circles or far left circles, you have people saying, we should all get together and live in big houses and have a chore wheel. I don't want to live in a big house and have a chore wheel. I'm happy living in this tiny little dumpy apartment and not doing my chores. So one question is, how do we, if we're looking to fix dystopia, if we're looking to save our world through our fiction, which is not going to work. Yeah, chore wheels never work, Amanda Quasar. That is correct in the chat. What do we do as writers, writing dystopias or utopias, to open up the possibilities as opposed to foreclosing on the possibilities? How do we write a utopia that feels utopian to most readers, or how do we write a dystopia that feels dystopian as opposed to utopian to most readers? And Vandana, we'll start with you. Tell us how to write these things properly.
Well, I don't write dystopias per se. I mean, some of my, but in order to write certain kinds of utopias, which I'm very interested in, I'm really interested in the utopian imagination. You can't talk about utopia without writing about dystopias, and especially because utopias exist, some kinds of utopias exist on the basis of dystopias for other people, right? Like Cory mentioned, capitalism. So that's why I've actually been thinking about what does it mean to talk about utopia, and I actually have a book coming out from PM Press in their Outspoken Authors series called Utopias of the Third Kind. So I've thought about that a bit, and I think that one of the important things to do is actually to make the dystopia real, to walk through the dystopia, to feel the pain, and to be informed by what's actually happening in the world. when we, at least for me, that's important when I write fiction, and then look for where are the sparks of light, where are the so-called, I wouldn't even call them solutions because that sounds mechanistic, but other pathways, other opportunities, other paradigms, and then illuminate them, because without that dystopic context, we don't necessarily see the other things, because dystopias challenge our assumptions about current reality. So that's what I try to do.
And Matt, you teach writing, so you've undoubtedly read a lot of garbage in the dystopian mode from your students. How should you write a good dystopia or a good utopia?
Oh, my students don't write garbage, Nick. Come on.
Oh, really? You were living a utopia.
I know. I've written a lot of garbage dystopia for sure. I think I agree with everything Vandana said too, but I think I've been thinking a lot in the last couple of years about because I think I have a dystopic plot brain, right? Like my brain makes up like terrible places for people to live and have struggles and stories. I also would like to be a utopian thinker. And I think I've thought a little bit about like what can be improved in an invented world, or what can be made, tried out or imagined in that sort of positive imagined future way. I was just talking to a writer, Sarah Blake, for an event about her novel Clean Air, which takes place in a climate apocalypse where half of the people on Earth have died. And it's clearly like a bad future. But in the aftermath of this dystopic event, we have like a universal basic income in this society, right? And you can sort of see it functioning in the story, and that people, kind of like you're talking about the imagined communist takeover, like people aren't exploited by being forced to work for food or shelter, things like that. And so the novel itself is like a dystopia, but there are these utopic pockets in it. And I actually think those do make the dystopia feel realer. Like the kind of like the road dystopia where like it's Mad Max and everything is like as bad as it can possibly be, seems probably not the outcome that's likely to happen, right? It'll be maybe degrees of bad, but it won't be total. And I think those are, somehow the utopic elements are actually what make it, give it its verisimilitude.
All right, thank you very much. Cory, how do you write utopias and dystopias in a way that
I think
not didactic?
I think we need to distinguish between dystopian furniture and dystopian scenarios. So imagining that things might break down does not make you dystopian or pessimistic, right? By the same token, imagining things can never break down doesn't make you an optimist. It makes you a reckless asshole, right? That's the thinking that results in not putting lifeboats on the Titanic. So I think that writing a novel in which everything has fallen apart is not inherently dystopic, even though things falling apart is unpleasant in the extreme. So, I wrote a novel, Walkaway, which is about people picking up the pieces after it falls apart. And it's neither an optimistic novel because there's no sense that they are foreordained to win, nor is it a pessimistic novel in the sense that what they do doesn't matter because the world is coming to an end. Rather, it's a hopeful novel that sort of implies that if you do stuff, you can change stuff, and that when you change stuff, you can figure out what else you can do. And that's, I think, the kind of dystopia that I find very satisfying. And I have several novels coming out. Again, I write when I'm anxious, so I have 8 books coming out between now and the end of 2025. And one of them is a book called The Lost Cause, which is a Green New Deal utopian novel set here in Burbank, where I live. And it's a novel in which we have successfully weathered the political challenge of resolving to do something about the climate emergency, like spend the next 300 years moving all the coastal cities 20 kilometers inland, but in which the actual work of doing that is very hard and involves like hugely destabilizing events like the hills catch fire and unsuspected Superfund sites full of volatile organic compounds are aerosolized and sterilize entire regions that people live in and create huge refugee crises in the middle of all of this, right? And so that's also dystopian in many regards, but in its outlook, which is to say like the posture it takes towards whether we are doomed to suffer or whether we can pull through, I think it has a kind of utopian bent. And I think of them as being in contrast with novels that I quite like but find politically very distasteful, which are the cozy apocalypses of the British 1950s and 60s, John Wyndham, Neville Shute, and so on, which are really about middle-class anxiety. You know, Neville Shute, you know, who wrote this novel about the end of the world on the beach, he basically wanted to exterminate the proletariat, right? He wrote these like long rants about how his mother, who would go to shops that were like carefully bourgeois before the war, now had to tolerate the uppity working people who thought that they could go to those shops too. And her circumstances were so reduced by not being able to get cheap home help anymore that she could no longer holiday make in France every year. And, you know, he, like Wyndham, wrote a bunch of novels in which all the proles are you know, become the unnecessariat and are eliminated, except for a few roving bands that are eventually dispatched by like bougie, upright English gentlemen who form communes on, you know, farms that they defend from the bad guys. And that's the plot of Day of the Triffids and like 7 other Wyndham novels. And they're very fun to read, and they're very satisfying in the way that, say, Ender's Game is very satisfying until you reflect on them, in exactly the same way that Ender's Game is very disturbing when you reflect on it and you realize that it's a novel about someone who gets called names and commits an act of genocide, but is nevertheless the victim here because the other guys called him names and made him commit an act of genocide. You know, it's quite a smuggled ideology.
And as an editor, you read a lot of
Well,
attempts,
I do read a lot. I do read a lot of submissions that come in. I've also read a lot of students' novels over the years when they send me those things. And to me, if you're writing dystopian fiction or really any kind of fiction, it's important to get the details right and to make sure there's enough of them that it makes sense. So, for example, if I'm reading a dystopian book about climate change 10 years in the future, it's important for me to know as a reader, where are they getting their food? How are they getting their food? You know, that's one of the things that bothers me a lot when I'm reading some of these books, is that I don't understand how the world works. They just have these characters and they find them in this place and they're somehow just moving through the book, but I don't really understand how the world is working. Where are they getting their clothes? How are they, you know, eating? All those kind of things that are important. You know, you might not want to show them sitting down to a meal, but you need to understand where the food is coming from if there are no more plants, for example. If there are no more animals, for example, what are they eating? So little details like that are important to me. And sometimes I see people write things and forget those kind of details. They don't really think about the wider world. They're just so honed in on this one character doing this one thing that they don't think about how that character really needs to interact with the world. Now, one book that I read recently that I really enjoyed was Clara and the Sun by Ishiguro. And the thing that I loved about that book is it was told completely from the point of view of this AI robot who has been created to be a companion to a teenage girl. So everything in the book you're seeing through her eyes, through the AI robot's eyes. And I love the way that she is experiencing the world, and that's allowing me as the reader to experience it through her eyes, to see how that world works. Now, of course, it doesn't give me the full complete picture of everything, but it gives me enough so that I understand what's going on. And so when things happen at the end of the book, it's just really revealing to me. And I thought that book was wonderful. Another book that comes to mind, it's called Element OP. This was a much older book that came out many years ago, where it's this island, and there's the that phrase, the quick brown fox, blah 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 blah, and every time a letter falls off that sign, that letter no longer exists in that world. And I really liked how that book played with how do you deal with that. That was very dystopian for me, and that reminds me of a novel I read last year, and I'm so sorry that I forgot the name of it and the writer, but it was translated from the Japanese, about a dystopian future where somebody makes a decision that a physical object can no longer exist. So for example, a pen can no longer exist, and then all references to pens anywhere in that world disappears. And I thought that novel was fascinating as well, the way that it dealt with that, where people just took for granted, yeah, that's the way it is. Those things don't exist anymore. So to me, I find those kinds of dystopians very interesting, and how people are able to deal with their connection to the world that they're in now. How are they maneuvering through it?
So even a dystopia that's outside of the realm of speculation and into fantasy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
The Memory Police. Thank you very much. Thank you.
All right.
Fabulous book.
One more question that comes to mind, I think, and feel free to add versions to this. I think there are two major versions of the dystopia. There's the dystopia of tyranny, where the inescapable government is doing terrible things and always watching you, surveillance state and truncated freedoms, and the dystopia of collapse, where all freedom is also truncated because other people are too free to start a band of roving gangs, or too free to just take what they want and that kind of thing. And we see this with the zombie apocalypse a lot, which was very popular some years ago. And these were a kind of dystopia that reoriented the characters toward giving them ultimate freedom. Can you shoot your neighbors? If they're a zombie, you can. Are they a zombie? Yes. So I'm wondering about these twin impulses of tyranny and collapse. And what is more frightening and what is more entertaining? Since we're talking, there's always this tendency to want to talk about the actual world. And of course, we use dystopian fiction to talk about the actual world. But on a level, we actually are talking about entertainments that we sell for $14.99 at bookstores like City Lights, and have panels about for bookstores like City Lights. So it makes me wonder, and I'll start with you, Anne. We'll go again across the panel. Collapse or tyranny? What do you see coming? And what do you see coming in fiction as a sort of a? And is there a third version of dystopia?
Well, now sometimes you can have both those things.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
You can have the collapse, and then tyranny happens because of the collapse, where the collapse is used as an excuse.
Mm-hmm.
Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I can definitely see that, but I think the dystopian, that the tyranny is probably more easy to overcome than, you know, if climate change overtakes our planet, what are we going to do? At a certain point, it doesn't matter who's in charge, whether it's a dictatorship or democracy or capitalism or communism. None of those things matter if we're all underwater or if we're fried. You know, if we have storms and fires and this and that and the other, there's only so much that we can do. So to me, that's scarier. The climate change, all of that stuff is a heck of a lot scarier than someone telling me that I can't use the letter P. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. Cory?
Well, I think Anne's really onto something. I mean, there's often, you know, this kind of nose turning up at people who aren't science fiction writers who write science fiction like material. But I think that we probably can break science fiction dystopias from non-science fiction dystopias in one useful regard. And that science fiction is primarily a pulp literature, which is to say it's a literature whose readers and writers expect the plot to be forward. And if plot is the thing that you put forward, wherever you're confronted with one of these binaries like man versus man and man versus nature, you go for a twofer. And it's like man versus nature versus man. The tsunami blows your house down, your neighbor comes over to eat you. And I think that, you know, Anne is right that in fiction, it's easy to imagine either of those things, right? It's easy, like you have Chernobyl, which is the tyranny that creates the collapse. And then you have, say, that zombie thing with that Laird did that got turned into a TV show, The Walking Dead, right? Where everyone becomes like either a zombie or like a barbarian prince with a harem who either takes you by force or murders you or leaves you to the zombies. And what I would quibble with Anne about is that I do think that your theory of human action, of what people do in times of crisis, matters a lot in terms of the real world when you reach a moment of collapse or authoritarianism. So, you know, that we all thrill to the "I am Spartacus" moment in the face of authoritarianism. You know, there are all these videos floating around now of you know, civilians in street clothes standing up to Russian soldiers, 1,000 people standing in front of a tank and forcing it to turn around, and so on. If you believe that your neighbors will stand in front of the tank with you, you might. But it takes an extraordinary kind of Tiananmen Square level of bravery to stand in front of the tank on your own. Likewise, you know, if you're convinced that when disaster comes, your neighbor isn't going to come dig you out of the rubble, they're going to come and like steal your stuff, then when you see them cresting the horizon, you meet them with a shotgun, not by, you know, saying, hey, my freezer stopped working, why don't we have a barbecue? And so, you know, that actually, I think, has a bearing on what happens in real world disasters, because there is no real world disaster that you solve by you know, cowering in a luxury bunker in New Zealand while people with more public spirit than you get the sanitation system working again, right? You know, you have to actually get the sanitation and the food system and the supply chain back up again to survive the disaster. And if you think that your neighbors will pull together, then you aren't going to be a bedwetter under Las Vegas with a, you know, a pool table and an Olympic swimming pool in your underground bunker. You will actually be out there digging through the rubble with the rest of us.
And Matt, given my question that was so cleverly designed for everyone to say both.
Yes.
Tyranny or collapse?
I've been trying to think of from a purely like entertainment value way, if there's like a third road, and maybe it's not quite that, but I'm thinking of like a dystopia that is just a want for like a reset game board, right? You reset society so that you can have a different kind of character agency, have a different kind of sort of like thing to sort of go through. There's some version of like the apocalypse that just makes everything different. That is the version of how in like children's literature, you have to somehow remove the parents so that kids have enough agency to like have an adventure, right? There's a version of that where dystopia gives characters like the freedom to adventure, or the freedom to act. You know, you don't quit your job to go on an adventure, right? You stay, do your work. And maybe after the apocalypse, that would be an interest. We talked about this before the panel started, what we would do in the apocalypse, and agreed we would not be interesting. But I could believe that I could be in fiction. And I think the like dystopia of collapse or dystopia of tyranny can both be really just ways to reset the board enough to give an interesting place for that kind of adventure, that maybe pulp adventure that Cory's talking about.
And Vandana, collapse, tyranny, third way? Are we there? Could you unmute her,
She's
Peter?
muted.
It's not a Zoom conference till someone speaks while muted.
Yeah, just working on it, folks. Working on it. We got some technical problems here. Trying to get her unmuted.
Technical problems. While we're waiting, we're going to have an Omelas fight. The chat demands an Omelas fight.
Vandana, can you hear us now?
Yeah,
Wait,
thank
Vandana's
you.
back?
I think the alien overlords who've been messing with my internet have also been up to mischief. But anyway, yeah, I think that the two definitely go together, because, you know, if you look at reality, like look at what's happening in my country, in India right now, where the right-wing authoritarian government is dismantling, you know, democratic norms. It is, and things are falling apart in many ways. So, you know, tyranny and collapse. Tyranny can cause collapse, and collapse can cause tyrannies to rise up. But I think that that the interesting thing is that although we very much see situations of people like tearing each other apart, we also see, like, for instance, the response to the pandemic, where many communities actually came together and took care of each other when the government, you know, didn't have its act together. And that is something that I'm really interested in. Like, how do people respond under different socioeconomic, you know, assumptions about how human nature works, and so, you know, what determines whether a dystopia is survivable and whether it's, you know, you can shift your direction towards utopia. If you think of utopia as a destination or a desire, rather than not a destination so much as a desire or a direction, then it becomes interesting in fiction to think about, like having collapse and tyrannies of either the minority sort or the large infrastructure sort woven together. Because, in a sense, you can't just look at climate change and say that that's simply an environmental catastrophe, because it's something that's caused by the power hierarchy. I mean, if you really look at it, that's where it's coming from, where the earth is being ravaged for a few fat cats at the top of the pyramid to fatten their wallets, at the expense of everyone else. So I don't think that inequality and collapse of the environment are unrelated, and therefore they have to go together, in my opinion.
All right. So I promise this to the chat. This will be our last thing. We're gonna have a fight about the ones who walk away from Omelas and the many answers to this story that have been written. And of course, for the two of you who do not know, Omelas is this utopian city. It's really great. And there's one little kid poorly treated in a basement somewhere, and somehow the utopia needs this little kid to suffer. The end. And of course, science fiction people just can't read that and think, aha, what an interesting story. They got to think, oh yeah, I'm gonna fix this story. And it is the worst impulse in the genre, as far as I'm concerned, to try to fix this story, to answer this story. But perhaps I'm in the minority, and we're gonna find out right now. Vandana, what do you think of these this tendency? I mean, you probably read a few of them, or at least heard about them, to answer or fix Omelas, which is this utopia with a dystopian streak that we've been talking about. Can you recommend any that you like? Do you have an answer?
Well, I mean, I think that's the fun of science fiction, right? I mean, you play with the stories and you make your own ending and so on and so forth.
I do hate fun.
Well, what? Say again?
I do hate fun, but go on.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Well, I really think that the story is intended as a philosophical exercise to point out something important. And I have a different interpretation, which I won't go into because I don't want to.
No, go into it. This is the panel's about that. Go into it.
Oh, okay. Well, I actually had an interesting conversation with Ursula K because I was going to talk about this at a conference, and I had an exchange over email with her because I had an interpretation that, well, people say, well, why not stay and fight the system? And I think that's a perfectly legitimate response, like Nora Jemison's response. It's totally makes sense to me. But the other interpretation is that if the system is built such that you have to have somebody suffer for everyone to be happy, then what in a way what she's presenting is a paradigm, and it's a kind of it reflects aspects of our current day socioeconomic system, that you cannot have all the comforts without making somebody suffer. That's essential for you to be comfortable. And so in a way, the people who walk away from Omelas, if you don't take the story literally, if you think of it as people who are walking away from a paradigm, from a way of conceptualizing the world, then it opens up interesting possibilities, because then you ask the question, well, what are those other worlds that you could live in where you wouldn't have this child starving to death and being ill-treated for the sake of other people's happiness? So that's the way I interpreted it.
All right. Matt? Omelas answers?
Yeah, I really like Omelas. I think about the story a lot, and I thought about it a lot during the pandemic. I think as so many people have said and have written about during the pandemic as if it's over, but in the sort of early days of it, going to the grocery store while I was working at home and staying at home, and you can see the people who are at risk in this very visible way for your life. And I think that is part of that sort of maybe some things are possible or visible that weren't in the past. I think one of the things I feel like I've been thinking a lot in fiction in the last 5-6 years, and certainly into the future, is this question of the intolerability of other people's suffering that makes your life possible, and also how inescapable that sort of feels. But maybe the proportion can be changed. And I think the ideal is the proportion is no one suffers, as Vandana was saying, and I think as the Guin is saying in that story. I think it seems like another thing you can do in science fiction is to try to imagine a different ratio or a different way of organizing. How do you move past that? I think I'm thinking in my own work right now about like designing fictional societies that are better than ours, but would still not be good enough, right? And the sort of like, where would that place where you continue to try to walk away, continue to try to fight, as opposed to accepting just a better ratio? And I think, I don't know, I'm very fascinated in that question. And the hope of zero, while the intolerability of one feels very present to me.
And Cory?
Yeah, well, I want to go back to where I started with this idea of capitalist realism and the notion that if you accept that there is no alternative, right, that suffering must occur, that the system must be as it is, that there's nowhere we can go, that it is a very dire and dystopian place to be, because you are living in the best of all possible worlds, and it's manifestly not very good. And, you know, it always struck me that there is no alternative is the most anti-science fiction thing that Margaret Thatcher could have said, right? And in some ways it's that excellent form of rhetorical sleight, which is to disguise a demand as an observation. So when she says there is no alternative, she means stop trying to think of an alternative, right? We're done talking about alternatives. And your discussion of Omelas reminds me of a lot of the ongoing debate about the cold equations and Tom Godwin, you know, which is a story about a guy who's taking a spaceship to a planet to deliver some vaccines to save the planet. And he discovers a girl who's stowed away on the ship, and he won't have enough fuel to land it with both of them. And so he has to stick her out the airlock because there is the facts don't care about your feelings. The universe has conspired against her, and here we are. And the reality is Godwin rewrote that story 6 times with 6 different ways that captain could land the ship without killing the girl. And John W. Campbell kept sending it back to him to say, no, the point of the story is the girl dies, right? That it's called the cold equations, not the win-win proposition arrived at through creative lateral thinking, right? And it strikes me that, you know, given that Campbell was himself a rigid sort of fascistic fellow, and you know, a great admirer of the politics of Thatcher, or the politics Thatcher embodies. He was dead before she was in politics. That there's a kind of commonality there, right? This insistence that you not try to imagine another future. And so maybe to quibble, Nick, with your statement that the worst impulse is to try to rewrite someone else's story with a different ending. You know, I have published stories called, you know, I, Robot and Ender's Game and The Martian Chronicles and so on. So I'm the last person to agree with that statement. But I mean, I think that that is the most science fictional thing you can do, is to assert that if you change some variables, you can get a very different outcome. And I'm going to end there, but I'll paste in a link to my essay on the cold equations too.
All right, thank you. And Omelas answers your thoughts on the topic.
I'm just thinking about fan fiction.
Yeah.
Because this genre loves fan fiction, but the thing about this story that's so remarkable and why I love it so much is, think about, this story was published decades ago. And here we are in 2022, still talking about it. And I have a feeling that 100 years from now, there's going to be another room full of people still talking about this story, because this is one of the things that I love about it. It's timeless. It's dealing with issues that surpass, you know, history, time, place, people, whatever. I just feel like stories like that speak to so many people in so many ways, which is why we want to talk about them and also reimagine them and write fan fiction about it, because why not? And the cold equations is a perfect example of maybe kind of like a same type of puzzle that you find yourselves in a lot of science fiction stories, you know, not just those 2, there's quite a few others, but that doesn't make the stories just the same old thing. I feel like putting them together still brings you to that same place, that sense of wonder where you're trying to figure out how could it be and why not? You know, maybe there is a way. And it's like I was saying when we were watching all those stupid pandemic movies that, you know, even when you know people are going to die at the end, you still keep hoping that someone's going to make it out alive, and many people will make it out alive, even though you know it's not going to happen. We just are hopeful by nature, I think, for the most part, even the pessimists.
And it's true, we always talk about those two stories, and who knows, maybe one day science fiction will have a third story we can talk about, and that'll be an exciting day for all of us. And that's
Ben bites dog.
So does anyone have any final comments on Dystopia before we either scan the chat for an interesting question, which I see it's mostly comments in the proper science fiction panel way, or shall we throw it back to Peter? Any final words from anyone? I'll get a private message. I don't know how to work private message. Okay.
Well,
Yes. Oh, Peter's here. Fantastic. Save us, Peter.
Yeah. Wow, man, this has been such a rich discussion. I'm just having so much fun here. You know, Nick, thank you so much for doing the honors on this last session. I mean, really awesome job moderating. Thank you all. Matt Bell, we're going to see you in a few weeks. Really appreciate you being here. Cory, Doctorow, Vandana, Singh, and VanderMeer, ever grateful to you all for joining us, being part of this really awesome moment. So, I mean, this whole weekend has been just really incredible. We've got on so many different avenues. It's been a pleasure on many, many different levels. So it's such a great community out there too. So just loving to see what's in the chat. Very, very heartening. So want to extend our appreciation to everyone who helped make this weekend a reality. Special thanks to Stephen over at PM Press for all of his tireless efforts. We could not have done it without him. Also, to the editors of Dangerous Visions, Andrew and Ian, who actually, they've been getting up at 3 in the morning, for the last 2 days, and it's kind of crazy, and we love them for it. They were hugely instrumental in bringing all the puzzle pieces together. Big shout out to Ramsey at PM Press for knowing a good thing when he sees it and acquiring Andrew and Ian's book, I should say books. So this event was made possible by the City Lights Foundation, which now kind of like is the umbrella over our event series. And its whole mission is about fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture. So kind of furthering Lawrence Ferlinghetti's legacy into the future. Sad to see this program end, but we're really looking forward to continuing this kind of programming. And it's your support and enthusiasm that really encourages us. So, thank you, everybody. Please be safe, be well. We hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Wear your masks, please.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Take care. Stay safe. Bye-bye.